Welcome to the latest edition of our A.T. Kearney Procurement and Analytics Solutions Wave of the Future podcast series. I'm Helen Clegg, and I'm joined today by Claude Fidelin, Bryce Heller, and John Moyer from our A.T. Kearney Procurement and Analytics Solutions practice, where Claude is a Senior Sourcing Manager, Bryce a Senior Sourcing Analyst, and John a Director. The subject of today's podcast is should-cost modeling. Claude, Bryce, and John are going to define what a should-cost model is, when to use such a model, how to create one, and how to use should-cost modeling in negotiations. Claude, Bryce, and John, welcome to our podcast series. Now, Claude, I'd like to start with you and ask you to define a should-cost model and why should-cost modeling is a useful technique to master.
Hi, Helen. A should-cost model is really a calculation. It's really a calculation method, and it's something that you use to estimate the cost of a product. And this is really based on processing costs. So in there, we include things such as direct labor, energy, yields, but also factor in the market inputs, so really commodity prices. And of course, one thing that we need to highlight is that this is an estimate. And because this is an estimate, you need to factor in some assumptions as well. As of why it's important, I think as a procurement professional, one focus of negotiation is very often on the margin of the supplier. And what the should-cost model gives you is really an understanding of what's the cost that the supplier has to incur to produce that good, and compare it with the price that is being paid today or is being quoted by the supplier. And really, this is giving you an idea of the margin that you have to play with during the negotiations.
Claude, you've just defined a should-cost model relating very much to manufactured products, sort of producing goods. But can should-cost modeling be used to model service costs as well?
Helen, I would say it very much depends on the type of services. Some services really have a high correlation between the cost of the service and the price at which the service is being sold to customers. So let me give you two examples. If you think about programmers or maybe some temp services, those type of services are more like commodities in some aspects. You know how much it costs per hour to have this person doing a program, writing codes, or providing temp services, and you also have an idea of what's the margin that the supplier will charge for that. So in this sense, it's relatively precise to do a should-cost model. But then you have other services which are more focusing on the value-added services. So this is where it gets more challenging because for creative agency or even for consultants, the cost of the labor is not directly correlated to how much it's going to be charged to the clients. So that's where it gets more tricky, and it's probably less precise to do a should-cost model for services.
Okay, that's interesting. So, John, how do you actually build a should-cost model? Where do you start?
When we build a should-cost model, there's really three steps that we follow in order to develop the model. The first one is to develop expertise in the area. So we would research the product and the industry and map out all the steps of the production process in order to understand the cost drivers and the impact of yields and technology and scale. The second step then is to assemble the cost model. So we would develop all the cost elements based on the yields, the capacity and the complexity, the level of automation in the production facility. And then we would build this into a dynamic formula so that we could make changes to the inputs and create a user interface so that it can be managed and maintained in the future. The third step then is to review the model and revise it. So we would test the model with historic prices, validate all the calculations, and discuss the model and review it with our subject matter experts.
Thanks, John. Now, Bryce, I want to bring you in here and ask you for more detail around each of those three steps that John's just briefly outlined.
Sure thing. The first end of this process of developing the expertise is going to be very research heavy. So you're going to be digging through a lot of documentation and processes, as well as looking at feeds on different market prices for your raw inputs. And the goal of that process is to really recreate the process map and understand what the inputs are and the cost of the inputs coming in, and then also the yields of the process going forward. through that, you want to be able to identify all the input costs and any of the implications. So if there are byproducts that are going to come out of the process, finding out if there's credits associated with that, and then establishing a process map to see how the yields work out at each step and how much of this we're actually going to need and what the calculations and ratios are all the way through. So once you have all that put together, you can begin to assemble the model and start to refine it. So once we get into the refining, we want to start comparing it to the ROIs that you're seeing in the industry, and also estimating like what the plant investment and working capital would be for particular types of operations. So once you have your process map and all your cost inputs together, we'd like to assemble it in a kind of an Excel format that allows us to easily display the process and how the costs are being calculated, as well as use it as kind of a what-if tool facilitation. So if you have this much increase in your commodity price, what does that do for your bottom line? So it's really a facilitation tool from that prospect. And then once you have the model kind of locked down and kind of your logic behind it all set, then you can use that to map what the historical trends are doing and what current trends are doing, and then how the model is predicting things are going to go. And then that is the type of information you would take to leverage in setting up your negotiations.
So, John, we've got a should cost model. Which categories can you apply this type of modeling to? And do you have an example of a should cost model that you can share with us?
We've applied should cost models to a variety of different categories, including food and beverage, consumer products, and commodity chemicals. Within food and beverage, they're applicable to things like vitamins and dairy and soy proteins and salad dressings and cheese and meats. In the consumer products world, should cost models are used for developing the cost of surfactants and conditioners and emulsifiers and all types of packaging and inks and adhesives that are used with packaging. In the chemicals world, we've applied should cost models to resins and to commodity chemicals such as methanol and ethanol and other alcohols used as solvents, sulfuric acid, and caustic soda. Should cost models are very applicable in all of these areas. I'll give you a specific example. Some recent work we did in the food and beverage client was developing a should cost model for soy protein isolates to support negotiations with those suppliers. And the soy protein should cost model had some complexity due to considering the scale, the type of technology that was used. The level of protein actually in the soy varies depending on the weather and the area in which it's grown. As well as for these particular models, we had to take into account the value of the co-products, since most of the volumes of the co-products were much greater than the soy protein itself. So that's an example where we were able to use market pricing as well as an understanding of the technology and the process in order to develop a should cost model for soy protein that we could leverage in negotiations.
Claude, coming back to you, how can should cost models be leveraged in the negotiations process?
So using a should cost model is really important for negotiation, and it's really useful in two ways. First is to reassess your power position, and the second aspect is to better understand the supplier pricing strategy. So if you think about reassessing your power position, this is key in negotiation. You need to understand how much power you have, how much power your supplier have, and based on that, you really define your strategy. What we saw with the should cost model is that it provides some very valuable information prior to the negotiation. And there are many different ways you can use this information to increase your power for the negotiation. Some simple ways, such as increasing the team confidence. Can you imagine talking to your stakeholders and showing them your detailed calculations about what the cost of producing a good is, and therefore how much you should be paying? A second aspect is really also about having a legitimate ask to the suppliers. You know how much you should be charging. They should be charging. You know how much you should be paying. So you kind of feel confident when you go and ask that price. And the second aspect, again, related to your stakeholders, is really about the reputation and the trust. You really align people around you with facts rather than guesses and broad assumptions. The second aspect is around understanding the supplier pricing strategy. And by and large, you got two ends of the spectrum. If it's a commodity product, chances are that margins and profits are going to be quite low and not very differentiated depending on which supplier you buy it from. So that's where the marginal cost and the marginal profit is going to be quite low. But on the other end of the spectrum, you will have these situations where there's potentially only two suppliers that can give you the right product in the right region at the quality that you expect. And if those two suppliers know it, chances are that the cost and the price that they will quote you and they will try to sell it to you will be much higher than if it was a commoditized price. So understanding what's the approach of your supplier and where they sit in there can really help you refine your negotiation strategy and really use the right levers that will resonate with your suppliers and also resonate with your internal stakeholders.
Okay, that's all very well and good, but John, what do you do when a supplier you're negotiating with challenges your model?
Well, that shows that the model is beginning to work. What we want to do is engage the supplier to give us input into the model so we can see where the data may need to be updated if we've not taken into consideration changes in technology or yields or the impact of co-products into the model.
And finally, Bryce, circling back to you, from your perspective, what are the three main benefits of using should-cost models?
So the first one is this really helps understand the nature of the true cost of the materials that you're trying to source. And it also helps you identify what piece of the process is really driving the price of that product. And having that understanding is vital when you're going into discussions about these particular materials. The second one is around what Claude was addressing with the negotiations. It helps you have a more solid understanding and knowing where the supplier is coming from with their asks. So being more informed can help all the way around. And third, this is just a great way to get in tune with what's going on in the industry and how the process works. It gives you a lot of great background on what's going on and how the industry works, which is very key in going into a situation working with the materials.
Thanks, Bryce. So just to summarize, should-cost modeling is a really useful technique to master. It allows you to really understand the true cost of products. It's good for negotiations and gives you a better understanding of pricing, the pricing strategy of a supplier. However, you do need to do a lot of upfront work to build the model, but the payoff is worth it. And on that note, I'd like to thank our speakers today, Claude Fidelin, Bryce Heller, and John Moyer, for being my guests today. I'd also like to thank our production engineer, Tom Klein, in San Francisco. Thank you for listening to this edition of The Wave of the Future. If you have any comments on this podcast or have a suggestion for a podcast topic that you'd like to hear, please share your thoughts via Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @ATKPAS. This has been an A.T. Kearney Procurement and Analytics Solutions podcast production. Join us again soon for our next Wave of the Future podcast.